Welcome back to GraphQL FM, everyone. Tony, how are you doing?
Did pretty well. Not too bad. It's kind of a chilly day here in San Francisco, so I've got my hoodie all the way zipped up. But yeah, doing good. How about yourself, Mark?
The same, chilly here as well. The summer is over in Canada. It's pretty much like
It's
March 300 today. Winter is soon. Today we're having somebody who I think is kind of a superhuman. Built literally like what seems like 100 different GraphQL tools and maintains them. We're going to talk about GraphQL tooling. We're going to talk about specifically GraphQL-Mesh. Yeah, we're joined by Uri Goldshtein, founder of the Guild. How are you doing?
Uh, Good. Yeah, I'm not superhuman at all. I'm just working with other superhumans. So that's the trick. Yeah, and here I'm here in Greece, Corfu. I just got here a week ago, and here it's very warm, I guess, compared to Canada for sure. Um, so no hoodie here.
Awesome. Well, we're super glad to have you on. And I think whenever you're anybody who's built anything related to GraphQL, especially in the JavaScript world, probably has used one of your tools, especially from the Guild. So Tony and I were kind of wanted to know, like, can you? What's the Guild? What's your you're founder of the Guild? You built a ton of GraphQL tools. Is that what you do? Is there more to it?
Yeah. So I actually started the first time I started using GraphQL was when I was working in Apollo. We did the transition between I joined when we were Meteor, and we did this transition. We had these talks about what Meteor 2.0 would look like and things like that. And we can talk about that like we can have a whole podcast just about that. But then it turned into Apollo. I joined, and during my time in Apollo, I worked specifically on the GraphQL subscription spec. So I
Hmm.
worked with, I was like the Apollo part, and Rob, Zoo, and Lee were from the Facebook part. So we kind of like split the work, and Rob Zoo did the spec work, and I did the reference implementation. Um, and yeah, but at some point, and I wanted to continue this work because there's a lot of other interesting things that are possible. There's GraphQL subscriptions, but then there's defer and stream and live queries and all those things. But I saw that Apollo is like, for them at that moment in time, it was less interesting. But on the other hand, I saw that there might be a different model for building open source tools, other than or working in a giant company or having a startup that is funded by money, and both of those are amazing, but there were maybe another place for another model. So that's how I started the Guild, and I just gathered together a bunch of people that are already in the community, already doing open source, and we just became the Guild.
And what's
So
That's
that?
yeah.
wild.
What's that model? What's because
Um, So it's kind of like it's a group of individuals. Like one thing that you probably see is that you don't see any of our libraries, and maybe that's also why people are not really aware of how many libraries were built, because none of the libraries are under the Guild organization or something like that on GitHub. Like each library is under a person,
Mm.
and there's a meaning for it. Like it's kind of like, first of all, it's like individual responsibility.
Hmm.
Second of all, let's say if, I don't know, let's say I work on GraphQL Mesh and I'm slacking, it's much easier to fork and get the community around someone else, um, because I'm just an individual, rather than if it was under an org, people have the tendency of thinking that there's a better chance of this thing to survive for longer.
uh-huh.
And in my experience, I think it's the exact opposite. Like, I think that organizations have actually a tendency to like move on to the next, you know,
Mm.
most exciting thing, or like to the thing that would sell the best or make the most buzz in the community or something like that, and
Hmm.
won't have the time to deal with all the small, specific, annoying things. So the guild was kind of like, okay, let's just, there's amazing work going on from, GitHub, Facebook, all, those things. And then there's the startups like Prisma and Apollo. There's small gaps between those two. So we were just decided, well, maybe we can fill in those with like open source that is happening very slow, but directly, like every library, we took the idea from Facebook where every library we build, we open source is a library one of our clients is actually using in production. So until it's being used in production, we're not open sourcing it. So even though GraphQL-Mesh sounds like a really cool idea, until it was in production, we didn't open source it. So yeah, and
Whoa, okay.
yeah, so that's a bit about that.
Man, I really like that. Like the kind of taking on open source in a much different way than I think we've done for the past few years. Maybe, yeah, that's really cool.
I find like it almost like you build these tools for someone, for an org, and you said like you wait till it's in production to open source it. It almost seems like I see the guild building so many tools, and I'm like, how do they even like build these tools and think of these tools? But it's kind of a circle, right? It kind of like feeds. You work with organizations that have problems, you build tools, these tools end up solving problems for other orgs which have new problems, and then
exactly.
it's a pretty cool model.
Yeah, exactly. And like, so we took it, for example, one thing we're doing, we started just like, doing that like that. And there's two things here. One is that like all the tools we use are actually helping us in our work, because we're not funded or we're not selling anything. So we're not also going to hold on to tools that are not necessary. Like if someone would come in and say, here is a tool that is actually better than what you built, we will be very happy to like transition people it will just make our lives easier. So, so that's one thing. The other thing is that this feedback loop, we started even automating it. So recently, for example, let's say if you're now doing a PR for CodeGen, it runs all the local tests of CodeGen and everything. But then we have this thing called connected build. We actually connect to all the different builds and CIs of all our different clients, some of them in like really weird environments, and it feeds it back to GitHub, to the CI of GitHub as a task. And then we know like, okay, this PR, even though it's like completely in the open source world being done by someone else, we know that, I don't know, it passed through Microsoft's load tests or something, and then it came back. So, yeah.
Whoa.
So,
I assume, are these checks like public in the PR, or it's kind of a...
Yeah, so you can't, you can see like, I think it's just one task that says guild connected build or something. I'm not exactly sure how it is in the public. Underneath it, it goes to like, we actually use, in this specific case, we use Azure pipelines, and then we just call many different CIs and like some behind like, self-served bit buckets and all kinds of weird, tools and stuff like that. And at the end of the day, it feeds it back. So
that's awesome. Yeah. So one of these problems you've seen, I guess, from your clients is the problem GraphQL-Mesh solves. The main thing we kind of want to talk to you about today. Can you, so like for someone who's listening to the stream who has no idea what we're talking about, can you kind of give a little intro to GraphQL-Mesh and the problem it's solving or trying to solve?
Yeah, I'll try to make it short, but because it can go to many different directions. So I'll try to make the intro short. So the very basic way of explaining it is, so we have, so the very basic way of explaining it is just to say, well, we have many different API sources that we call to. And we also have a lot of existing API technologies. Like, there's a lot of, the more I think you use GraphQL, the more you realize, well, it has a lot of amazing ideas. A lot of those amazing ideas exist already in other API specs and things like that. Now, and most of our clients are coming also for, it's not, we don't build applications from scratch. Like there's a lot of legacy codes and things like that. So what we do is we thought, well, how can we leverage all those existing sources? And can we take like the philosophies or those existing specs, convert them into GraphQL, and will it still make sense? So now we can actually interact with the GraphQL language, even though behind the scenes it's something else. And then we can even merge all those different sources together. So it might be even also a game.
Right.
But just add one more thing that will maybe a segue to the next thing is that everyone, when they look at it, they just think, okay, we can take all of our sources and create a gateway. But this thing, we actually wanted to, yeah, it can also run as a gateway, but it can also just compile as a local SDK. So it can become a, your client maybe still will send calls to many different sources, but for your application developer, it looks like it's one GraphQL endpoint.
So I was reading GraphQL-Mesh docs last night, and I never realized you could compile into a client SDK, and I thought that was such a good idea because running a server gateway comes with a kind of a known complexity that not necessarily everyone would like to handle, and maybe like you can't even convince your CTO or your team of running this in production. On the other end, it doesn't mean your clients won't want to interact with all these like SOAP and REST APIs. So you can kind of give them the power, and yeah, it looks like it's GraphQL, but it really isn't. So that I find that's so amazing. Is that kind of why you went that way? Like, did you have trouble convincing people to run that whole thing and use GraphQL on the server?
Yeah, it was actually interesting because we had two different use cases for it. One is exactly what you said. Like, we had a lot of clients that just started using GraphQL just on a client. For many, many reasons, some of them are even just internal politics or bureaucracy or things like that. And the front end or, the product just decided to just build get a lot of the benefits of GraphQL, even though it's not the actual thing over the wire. Like I saw from, the first episode that you made, like, I couldn't agree more that GraphQL has so many benefits, beyond just less data over the wire and less requests over the wire.
Yeah.
So you can do that without GraphQL-Mesh, right? And then people started building like a whole, just using GraphQL.js or even like GraphQL tools, and build like a whole like the resolver layer on the client. The thing. Like what I think that so one concept that you were talking about is like the GraphQL layer should be the product schema, and that's not necessarily the schema of all your services. So I couldn't agree more. But then what I thought was, well, okay, so let's say we build those application, like the model or the application schema in GraphQL. Then we go to our resolvers and we call the services. Maybe there we could also use the same language. Like maybe we can take those data sources and then call them as if they were GraphQL. So then what we get is basically two GraphQL schemas. One GraphQL schema, which is your product GraphQL schema, which is the main schema that everyone is talking about. But then another GraphQL schema that basically represents all the different data sources that you have, all the different microservices. And then what you can also do is start to compare and see, what I think you and I are talking with a lot of people and trying to explain theoretically. Now you can actually see two schemas and you can see the differences. And so that's one part. And the other part, you get a lot of cool things when you call the services as if they were GraphQL. So that was one use case. But the same thing goes for, let's say, I don't know, a machine learning service in your backend, right? Also there, you don't care about, a lot of back and forth or performance, but still the service developer wants to interact with, something that is a graph of data, and not necessarily need to know, like, is this service uses gRPC and this service, I don't know, uses SOAP, or anything like that.
Yeah.
So
how do you so you've got this graph that's more of your data / service graph, and then you were talking about a product graph that's the one kind of you expose to end users. How do these graphs share anything in terms of like implementation, or like how do you annotate or tag something as, hey, this is part of my product and this is not, or like I want to apply this transform maybe?
So I think, at the first, when we launched GraphQL-Mesh, to be honest, we didn't really care about that problem. Like, a lot of people are trying to, like, I don't know, declare something as both, or like save some lines of code. I think we are generally, we're in the school at this point of the guild, we're more like, well, it might take you a bit more time to build it, but then the day-to-day experience of the developer would be best. So sometimes, we didn't care to save some, or, if you needed to redeclare some of those fields in those two. But then after we launched it, we actually got one use case where people started actually using GraphQL-Mesh as a gateway, because the merging of, let's say, all the different services was kind of similar to what they would want as the product schema, but needed some transformation. So we added, like in Mesh, the ability to transform each individual schema. And then also after the merged schema, you can also transform it and do all kinds of things with it. So we start to see more and more people that actually are, it's all, everyone asks for the right solution. We're kind of like trying to make everything as flexible enough, because in the real world, you never have the perfect schema, whether it's a service schema or a product schema.
That's very true. So I think for me personally, when I look at GraphQL-Mesh, there's one main thing that would worry me about running it as a gateway, and I'm interested to see what kind of solutions and I think it's, so we keep talking about like GraphQL, that N+1 problem and that performance issue.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that there's nothing that could stop GraphQL-Mesh from like batching calls to those services. But that kind of implies the services support a batching function of some kind. Is that something you've run into? Like maybe, I think for things like OData, they might be generic enough for you to make these batch calls. For other things, would you kind of ask the service like, hey, you might need to give us a batch function that we can call during resolution or something?
Yeah, exactly. It's so there's a few things here. First of all, when you merge those, you have a lot of different services, and then you merge them, and then let's say you run them as a gateway. Now, all those different sources in that case are remote sources. So then we get into the whole discussion of remote execution, where there you can use, there's federation, Apollo Federation, and there's schema stitching, and there's, Hasura remote joins. Like, there's a lot of interesting things happening in that area. And I'm probably missing a bunch. Gatsby is doing something interesting that we now took their ideas as well.
Nice.
So there's the question of how can you optimize that, right? Like, do you need, and that comes from the question of, it comes from the question of also what are your sources capable of? And in our case, many times those are services that we have no control of, and the reason they're using whatever, let's say SOAP, is they're not going to migrate, they're not going to add some features, like it's just there.
Yeah.
So in that case, we try to give a lot of flexibility of what you can do on the gateway level.
Okay.
And that's something that I think and again, I'm not saying like, so Apollo Federation, for example, really advocates for, there's no code running in the gateway at all, which I think is good when it's possible.
Yeah.
But in our case, we see a lot of, first of all, it's also for like teams. Sometimes teams do want to write code at the gateway because that's the gateway team, or for whatever reason they build their teams in a certain way. Second thing is you want to add some logic, you want to add some optimizations, and you can't or don't want to do it at the service level. Maybe the service also was built to be agnostic and was built to specifically not to be aware of other services and the types of connections between them. So I think, so in GraphQL-Mesh, first of all, we try to be not opinionated about that, meaning GraphQL, like you can't say, is GraphQL-Mesh, let's say, better than Apollo Federation, because you can use Apollo Federation as your merging strategy in GraphQL-Mesh. So the merging strategy is also pluggable. So let's say the two choices today are Apollo Federation, and you can ask the question, well, if I have a SOAP service, how can I make it a GraphQL federated services? Then I can explain about that. Yep. And then there's the schema stitching way, which we took over GraphQL tools from Apollo a couple of months ago. And we basically almost rebuilt schema stitching from scratch. We added tons of features to it, like made it much more performant. And we're actually going to probably rename it in the next 2 weeks. So people would know it's like, because there was a lot of talk about like schema stitching is deprecated. Well, I think it was deprecated in a certain context. I think what we did is kind of like this approach, and the code could still be something a bit different, or maybe used for some other different use cases from Apollo Federation. It should still live there. And we see more and more people are hearing that schema stitching is not deprecated, and we're like, oh, okay, cool. And then they're trying it, and they're like, okay, it's actually good for us. So
somebody asked if you have a name for this new schema stitching strategy.
We're debating. I think there's somewhere in the GraphQL tools repo, or a discussion or an issue about V7. If anyone has names, we would love to hear them. Like we're very bad at naming things. So any idea would be amazing.
You say you're bad at naming things, but then all your open source like projects have like amazing like banners, like image banners and animations. Like your GraphQL-Mesh, like a planet spinning or something. That's pretty amazing.
Well, we're lucky to have. I have a very good friend. If anyone wants to use his services, also. And he's just amazing designer, and we were like, and he's not even a developer, and we just came up and told him all ideas, and he was like, and came up with those things, and we would never, I don't know, we were lucky about it. On the other hand, we didn't have our own websites for, I don't know, until recently. Now we just opened the website, and you can see on the website, we didn't use his services, so the website's like super. It's like very basic, but at least it has some blog posts and some links to our open source stuff.
Oh yeah, no, they're
at
great.
least we have a website now. So, yeah.
It looks like Tony is back, but as a viewer, and has a question for you. Wondering how you manage the service-to-service components of the mesh. Oh yeah, so like anything related to like timeouts, circuit breakers, auth. Is that something GraphQL-Mesh takes care of, or are people expected to bring their own code in there?
Yeah, so it's all pluggable. Like depends on the context. So let's say I have a service-to-service and I want to like authenticate before. Then yeah, like you basically have a function that you can authenticate each call, and you can do it or on the merge schema, or like as a transform on the merge schema, or actually on individual services. So like you can even like do different strategies for different or different, authentication, like sources or identities per different service, which sounds weird, but I mean, we've seen all kinds of weird things. So I think some of those things probably won't be interesting for anyone. And yeah, so on service to service is interesting because there's another question, like, let's say I have a service on the network. How do I know? So the first thing is, how do I know all those schema, like all the services available to me, and how, where do I get their schemas if they have a schema? So again, here you can use whatever registry, you can make it manual. Like sometimes nobody has a registry, so you just, you can't rely on the registry, you can't rely on the infrastructure. So you can just use it as a file, you create a file. And many times, in many cases, the creator of, let's say, the Mesh SDK or the Mesh gateway basically decides what they think are the schemas of the services, because we can't rely on them.
Interesting.
And which I guess in GitHub, you're lucky not to have those issues, but in like the companies we work with, you can't rely on those things. And then there's another question of, okay, there's a schema, but it might not be correct, which is, or it might change. We can talk a lot about preventing breaking changes on the GraphQL layer level, but what happens underneath? So that's another cool thing. If you're now starting to convert, let's say, a SOAP schema or an Open API schema to GraphQL, now what we can do is that, first of all, we can track the live requests and, in parallel, or even depends on what you want, compare it to the schema that we think we're going to get, and we can notify you in real time if you're starting to get something that you're not supposed to get. So that's another, that's another benefit of getting a schema out of the services that, might not be GraphQL or not necessarily, but then you can also run tools like whatever, GraphQL diff library you use, like, let's say, Inspector in our case, but you can run it on the services that are not GraphQL. So now we can understand breaking changes in a GraphQL schema diff on services that are not GraphQL at all.
Yep, you interpret the diff using GraphQL, even though they have no idea that they even use GraphQL, right?
Exactly. Like I'm sure in your case, like you're thinking like, well, that might be dumb. Like I can just ask that from the service that I'm querying. They should do it with whatever technology they're doing, and they probably can do it much better. In our case, in many clients that we have, you can't rely on them. Like you can tell them, you can explain to them, but maybe the team is like, would never get to it. So you have to build like your own.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it makes total sense too, because you're comparing what the end user is actually going to receive. So like your GraphQL breaking change is the real breaking change. But does that mean GraphQL-Mesh is like super resilient to changes in services? Like if something stops, I don't know, if some REST service stops sending a field, are you able to drop that field, or is everything kind of like nullable in a GraphQL schema?
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. So I mean, it's also flexible. So I mean, in most cases we use and it depends on your merging or federation / stitching / whatever new name, will come into those strategies. Like, what do you do when? So we have, first of all, you can take care of it in Mesh. You have the flexibility of where to take care of it. Like for example, in stitching, there's ways to deal with it. I'm sure in federation as well. But also you can take care of it in the transform on the specific service. Like maybe on that specific service, you want to act in a specific way. Maybe you want to turn into a cache. Maybe you want to call it, and I don't know, whatever. So you can also take care of it in the transform of the specific service, if it makes sense.
Yeah, makes total sense. So I'm trying to So you're dealing with a lot of legacy APIs from what I'm understanding. So which is why you're building so many different patterns and you've seen so much different
Fortunately,
things.
yeah.
Who reaches out to you about mesh? You like kind of like a person in organizations. It are they like people dealing with the clients more than some of
It's
the backend folks?
it's
They
a
kind
good
of want to
question,
get
and
liberated.
the answer is also very weird because I'm trying to keep my answers short, but it's like here also there's a lot of different people. Like some
Of
people are
course.
looking at Mesh and are like, okay, I want to build an app from scratch. You know, this is like a magical new tool that will solve all my problems in a magical way. I want to use it. So there's those people, and then a lot of people I think are coming also from the world that we're talking about. Now, one thing, by the way, that really um, made a big confirmation for me about the idea was actually from your, I bought your amazing book and I joined
Oh, thank
your
you.
Slack, the Slack community, and I started having a conversation with this guy from Uber, and we then later on like met and we talked, and I started realizing that there's a lot of companies who are building similar things, just they created their own GraphQL for the merging of all the different services. I think in Twitter, and I don't know, I'm probably hand waving here, so it might be like completely off, but in Twitter, there's like this Strato thing, something.
Yep. Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
So you still get, and also, by the way, in Facebook, there's also something a very interesting library in Haskell that does something very similar to GraphQL, but in Haskell for many different services. So actually, like talking with this guy from Uber, I was like, well, wow, like this idea actually makes a lot of sense, and it just happens to be that this graph we can also do it in GraphQL, but there's similar concepts in other types of technologies. So yeah, the variety is very broad. Like I think the conversations with Uber were amazing, and like we kept now. They also have their own codegen, so we now start to work with them on like maybe they're starting to use the GraphQL codegen for the flow stuff,
Nice.
and so even though there's different things, the concepts are there. So yeah, there's a variety of things, and that's why it's also hard to explain what GraphQL-Mesh is, and also hard to tell people why it's not magical. It's just, it's just, it can be a very small tool, and because of that, it can be dropped into many, many different things.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
That makes total sense. You mentioned earlier you that Federation tries to remove code from the gateway. GraphQL Mesh has more code in the gateway, but the examples I see are often centered around a config file. Um, is that the primary way you interact with Mesh, or is there also kind of like a library, like a server-side library you can actually like customize and write gateway code?
yeah. So first of all, it's not, again, GraphQL Mesh can run Federation
Right.
code, like the Federation query planner, and those things. Maybe I'll mention it very briefly. Like Federation basically takes GraphQL and then adds some metadata on it in the form of directives to basically represent connections between different services. I'm probably like killing the explanation right now, and people from Apollo will probably like destroy me. So sorry about that. But let's say that that's the case. Now, so that metadata. So we already took. So you have a federated service, like means it's GraphQL plus some metadata. Now, in our case, we have let's say a SOAP service. The SOAP service, we did one step, which is to take that SOAP schema and like convert it into a GraphQL schema or a gRPC, right? So convert it into a GraphQL schema. Now, what we can do, we have this, like we're using a library from the community, which we take a GraphQL schema, we add the metadata on top of it. Not necessarily in the form of directives, but just you add the same metadata just in a different form, and now you got yourself this thing. Now, who adds that metadata? The question is, no matter what the technique is, the question is who adds that metadata and who is responsible for it. So
yeah, because
I think that there's no one answer for
right.
it, right? Like so in if you're now going and building a Apollo federated service, as the service owner, you're responsible of those adding those directives. You're responsible to know that this field is an ID field on another service. You're responsible for that connection. In many cases, people don't want to do it, whether it's right or wrong. So first of all, by still using federation inside Mesh, but just adding this metadata in a different place, we now took that decision and maybe put it on a gateway team or maybe another service team. Like we decoupled this thing, and in some cases it made people easier.
Yeah.
Now that metadata, what we saw is that in stitching, it's similar to that as well. So in stitching, we did it. So the config file of Mesh, first of all, configs the basics, like what are the different services that I'm calling, or which registry should I get it from? But then it can also add, in the config, we added the option of what are the connections. So it started with just calling a resolver, because schema stitching, the first thing is schema stitching is you just add a field and you add a resolver. Right. You like actually write code to do that, which is a plus and minus. But then we started, as we started improving schema stitching, and we started also learning the differences between federation. Like it's the only place you can actually mix and match federation and schema stitching. So we started like playing with this, and we started to see that, well, in schema stitching, we can also declaratively add some of the information. And this config file, like you said, it can be just a static file that you can, someone from the community, for example, created like this Docker image, and you can just send it, you just send it that file, and that's it. You get a gateway, like a magical gateway running. But it can also be programmable, so you can just like you can program this thing and run it. And
so would it be completely wrong to say you can you can take a federation approach to merging the graph, but instead of you almost like centralize federation, which is very weird to say, but like you centralize federation configuration, but then execution is still federated, right?
You can now. You can keep those. You can keep those. Because you can use the federation merging. You can just do it as again, like let's call it Apollo Federation, because federation, like there's a lot of as more we started talking to people started getting angry at me that like I'm using federation in that context. Like federation is a lot of things, there's even a Webpack federation now. So like there's everything is a federation now. So like the Apollo federation, so you can still not use any transform. Like let's say you have a service that is GraphQL and it has all the directives and has all that metadata. That's great. It's still federated. But now let's say you don't have it. Then the question is who is in charge. Now, again here, the fact that it's at this end of the day it's running in a central gateway or in a central SDK, whatever it is, it doesn't mean that the person who writes it is the person who needs to run it.
Interesting.
Meaning, that's another thing that we see a lot in the GraphQL world. We see that a lot of people are running towards, even though we maintain, for example, schema stitching, we tell people like use stitching as the last resort. Like you don't necessarily need to use stitching. Everyone is going to stitching or federation because they want to, like each team to be responsible for certain types. Apollo GraphQL tools give you like even simple tools which just takes two, like I don't know, GraphQL executable schema and just merge it, and then you still have like a gateway that is a very like regular GraphQL gateway. There's no remote execution. There's no fancy things. It's more performance. It's more predictable, but you still can write it in separate teams. And more than that, what we now are working on is So in that, you can just use like GraphQL tools merge schemas, which is just a simple thing that merged the schema, no remote execution, no nothing. Then there's GraphQL modules, which you like a bit more constructive wrapper around these different modules. But again, it's all merged into one. But then what people said was, well, we want to keep their gateway running and just deploy different versions of a specific theme of the schema. Also there, if you really know, let's say Kubernetes well, you know that you can run each bundle, JavaScript bundle, you can run as a separate Kubernetes instance, and you can still get like even these characteristics without the remote execution of GraphQL. So what we started to see is like when people say we want to separate things or how to separate and how to scale GraphQL, they're too quickly jumping for the end of the spectrum, which is separate everything, separate the schema, separate the thing, separate the execution, which is fine, but it also has costs to it.
That's such a good point, and you're right. It is a spectrum because you can separate things at many different kind of layers, and like I think one of my biggest pet peeves is we're so focused on the SDL sometimes that everything's about splitting up that SDL or like that mental schema we have, splitting it. But you can split your code that then generates a single schema. You can split your infrastructure. You can split and it depends. And I mean, none of them are wrong or right. As you said, like it depends what you actually need. But you're right that often we jump on like, okay, everything must be running separately, defining their own schema separately, resolving separately. So that, yeah, I think that's a really, really good point.
Yeah, that's another thing where people think that, if, first of all, like you have code first approach, which is, again, then it's like, there's no big secret. You just write different classes and, you separate different, you just use programming. The same thing you can do with SDL. Like sometimes people tend to forget that, at the end of the day, it's just an executable schema. I'm talking about the JavaScript ecosystem right now, yeah? Like it's more where we are, but it's just an executable schema. So you can, even if you write SDL, you can still write SDL. It doesn't mean that at the end of the day, it won't be merged into one runtime, a predictable runtime.
Yeah, that's so true. But I find it's hard to have these conversations because everybody has a different meaning of like
exactly
of federation in general. Like, what are you federating? So yeah, this is really cool. I kind of want to talk a bit about GraphQL modules because I think that's a super interesting idea. And I haven't had to deal with it because, as you said, we just use a code first approach. So you use whatever module your programming language uses. So is this something in a JavaScript environment? Is this something you see a need for right away? Is that how, like, if you were starting a GraphQL server today, would you be starting with those modules? A big problem people complain about is that decoupling of resolvers and SDL often leads to issues. I think modules kind of like bundle that a bit closer together, so it's easier to maintain. Would you recommend that to anybody listening right now?
So no, I wouldn't use GraphQL. Just like I wouldn't tell people start with federation, or I wouldn't tell people start with stitching. I wouldn't tell people start with modules. I think it's like there's a whole spectrum of that. And after that, like you said, there's all this different. Like in your last sentence, you said like it's hard to talk because there's so many different like to explain and talk with people because there's so many different like names and like things for the same thing. So I'll even add another example to it later if I remember. But it makes it all even more crazy. So SDL. Let's talk just briefly about SDL and code first. And I think one of the very interesting, so there was always this debate, SDL first or like code first, and what are those things and everything. And it's a very, sensitive topic. But I think one very interesting discussion was in your first podcast with Dan, which, you know, GraphQL came from Facebook with and what he said there was very interesting for me. He said we had the ant layer, and the ant layer, you know, they already had it, and they started building it in PHP, and it was there. You know, it was there to basically describe the application model. Now the question is, well, so for them, it doesn't make any sense to use the SDL. I think at the same go at GitHub, right? At GitHub, you had, you know, Ruby, you built that code already. So now introducing a new thing doesn't make any sense. This thing already does it, and you have the skills for it. It's like it doesn't make any sense. I think in our case, what we see is that where it does make a lot of sense for us is that in kind of environments, sometimes, first of all, I find SDL the easiest and the most simplest and the most straightforward way to explain the model of the application. Like the language is so intuitive, like they didn't mean to do it, but it's just so intuitive. I couldn't find any better language to do that. And when you want to start from scratch, like you have a lot of legacy code, or you have a lot of different services, or maybe if you start from scratch and you just want to clearly think about the model and have a discussion about it, definitely if some of the people are from different backgrounds, whether they're in different programming language or maybe even they're like program managers, going and building the model in SDL is extremely powerful way to explain it. And it's really extremely easy. And it's kind of like, it's the same discussion as the contract first approach in other API specs. And I just found that, like, for me, I just found that the GraphQL, first of all, the GraphQL concept of a graph together with the SDL is just the best way for me to write a contract. So then I just, in many environments, for me, it's much easier to just write the contract first and then write the implementation. Now, and then you get, you know, tools to connect those two. So the codegen, I think, is more important in that context, for example, the modules. Because you write the contract and then you just want to make sure that you're actually adhere to the contract. So, that you don't need to waste programmers' time for it. Now, people can complain about, you know, setting up the codegen is hard. I think, again, for us, there's a very big difference than like the first few hours of setting up something than the years later where you need to actually maintain this thing. And again, throughout the years, codegen, you know, codegen today is not codegen even 6 months ago, is not the codegen 2 years ago, is not the codegen 4 years ago. So it keeps becoming easier. Another thing that, you know, there was this big Prisma blog post about SDL versus, one of the things that they said there was like, the SDL based tools are not maintained. The problem is that there were two companies that were tasked with maintaining those tools, which Prisma was one of them.
Right.
So that's again the gap that we as the guild tried to like solve, and we worked with Prisma. Actually, Prisma moved, you know, GraphQL CLI, GraphQL config, GraphQL import to us. Apollo moved GraphQL tools for us. And then there's Ricky and all the work that he's been doing on the language server and GraphQL. Right. So all those things are also progressing a lot. So not to say that I still think that in many contexts, you know, using type, again, I'm talking just about the narrow JavaScript world right now, but using like Nexus or using type GraphQL makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
By the way, Nexus also generates code. You know, it just runs the generator at the back.
Right.
So it's, yeah. So just, I think that the discussion that you had in the first blog post was really interesting for me to get this perspective on SDL. Now, sorry for
but it's fine. I do want to talk about SDL because I think what you said, like, you brought a lot of nuance, and I think you convinced me a little about using SDL. So Tony in the chat said as well, SDL helps for communication. I think you're right. As you said, like, if every situation is different, and if you don't have like a solid model or like domain for your app, and GraphQL and writing SDL is what helps you, well, it's better than not having a model for your app. So I think there's two things to me that still make me prefer a code first approach. The first one depends a lot on where the community is heading, but it seems you're always fighting an uphill battle by using the SDL to define your schema because it wasn't initially the use case, and it seems like, and the spec is not moving. So like, I see a lot of people want to add like maybe like generics or maybe even things that would let you like, let's say a connection, like a relay connection, you would just be able to like write connection in the SDL, and that would like expand stuff like that. And that's all solvable by tooling, which is fine. But then the code first approach as well, that's solvable by tooling. You can, they almost like merge, because every solution, they end up building tooling to generate an SDL in the end almost sometimes.
Exactly. I think we're not. By the way, we just recently joined the GraphQL Foundation, which was really cool. Like for me, like as a small guild, weird people, we just now part of the foundation, and it's nice. I think we're not advocating actually. It's weird maybe because, even though we build a lot of tools for the SDL and we care about it and we think, we're using it a lot in our approaches, we're never advocated to add any of the things you mentioned into the spec itself. Maybe because, we see this, how it's solvable without.
Right.
And I very much agree many times with Lee about, I think, the foundation in general, like how little the spec changed. And we're not advocating, even though we're using SDL in most of our use cases, we don't advocate to add any of those things. And even for our tools, sometimes adding those things makes it even harder.
Interesting.
So we don't, again, we're not in the, I think a lot of times when people want to add those things into the SDL, again, they think about maybe typing a bit less or something, which for us is not a real concern. Like after working years in Meteor, I know that all the new frameworks that are trying to show you that, like, if someone ever build an app with Meteor, it beats all the new stuff. Like, if you want to write like very little code and get something quickly, it's fine. But we moved a bit away from those things. So, but yeah, I think so. Yeah, I agree with you completely. I don't want to add a lot of things to the SDL in favor of those things.
Right.
And
at the same time, like, so you mentioned like contract first and like design first is super, super popular on kind of the REST side of things. Like it's talked a lot about, and I'm a fan of that approach as well. I think it's great. But I find, so the SDL, as you said, is a great language. It's so nice to define that model we're talking about, but I find it's not as verbose and precise as something like OpenAPI. So like if you want to do contract first with OpenAPI, like you've got tags to help you organize. You've got like JSON schema, which you can basically do anything with, like, including probably like a programming language.
Sure.
GraphQL like has directives, which are kind of like open. You can kind of build what you want, but there's nothing in the spec like. If you had something more complete like OpenAPI, those GraphQL docs generator could generate something so much more powerful, and your contract would be just more precise, right? Because like you've got an argument, it's typed, but there's no like min max or any of the like extra stuff JSON schema brings. So yeah, I guess like where do we go from there?
It's a good question, I think, but I think in that context, like it's the same whether you use SDL first or code first, right? Because you let's say you in code first, you have those directives, or you have these concepts, or you have those concepts in the language. Then you need to compile it to SDL. Currently, you're kind of like lose that information. Maybe you can compile it into the description or something like that, but you can't compile it to the SDL and later generate an SDK from it that takes those things. Maybe you can, if you write, again, it's the same thing with the annotation. We can agree on something. So I think in that case, I think it will come. I think, someone from the community maybe would start adding those things. It will become, very popular, and then the discussion will come into the spec, and we'll get there. Like, I think changing the spec is possible. I'm happy that it's hard.
Yeah.
So I think there's just, and again, this is solved by tooling. Like, let's say you and me agree on this, and you're doing it in Ruby, and I'm doing it in JavaScript or the CodeGen or whatever, and we agree on, let's say, how to write annotations or how to write some kind of a metadata on the description or whatever. Then we can create our own spec, and if it will become popular enough, maybe it will get into the.
Yeah, it'd be nice because you're right that SDL or code first, like the AND artifact can't be more precise than what the spec says, which hasn't been a huge problem. But in terms of like, if we want to go like full API first, and like having like really complete like let's say there's already a few like GraphQL mock servers, but they all operate on their own, like you must have this directive, and it'd be so nice if you could just drop any schema, like valid GraphQL schema in all tools, and they allowed you to do more like an @example, @tag, that kind of stuff would be great to see.
Yeah, I mean, stuff are happening. It's slow, but I think there's like, I know that there's the GraphBack people that they're trying to add. Like, another point of that is like, there's the whole world of like GraphQL from data sources or something like that. So there's the whole thing of like CRUD operations over types. So there's, the GraphBack people, I think, are trying to come up with a spec there. There's all kinds of things happening, but it's, again, I think for us, because we're, we hope it will slowly happen. I think, for example, I wanted to, okay, let's continue. Sorry, I just, my mind was like, I can talk for hours.
No, go for it. If you had a thought in your mind, go for it.
No, I was just suddenly remembered about what you said that I told you that I'll remember, which is like that there's the whole different, different names and different things for stuff. So when I started thinking about GraphQL-Mesh, I again started thinking, well, okay, we have this schema and that schema, but what if, I'm not saying it's a good idea, and I'm not saying advocating for any of this, and I'm not saying that this is a good thing, but what if that all those services schema and or again, like I would say, well, using GraphQL as service-to-service communication is not good. But then I said, well, but why? And then, okay, because maybe the execution on the provider is a problem. But what if we take that execution and put it on the client as an SDK? And then is it a good idea? So then the next phase after that, which is something that we already have POCs on it, but like I said, until we don't have it in production, we're not going to open source it. But if someone sees that use case as something valid, then talk to us, because we want to actually work with someone on making it happen. Is, well, what if I do want to write a gRPC service? But maybe I don't. What if the way that I want to describe the gRPC service API, I want to build it contract first. So let's think about the contract of that gRPC service. Well, let's write that contract in GraphQL and agree on that schema. Now, and say it's a schema and resolvers. But now we would write, let's say, SDL and resolver code, take those two things and actually compile it down into a gRPC service. So basically you write GraphQL, but you generate
gRPC services. That's pretty cool. I was just talking with a coworker before this about kind of that GraphQL to protobuf conversion, and that colleague was saying it's easier to generate protobuf from a query than from a schema.
Mm-hmm.
So like we have like existing services that consume
Interesting.
GraphQL, and then it'd be nice to like look at the query, the queries they're using, almost like persistent
Oh,
queries,
yeah.
and then a persistent query equals a gRPC service, basically.
Right. Because the let's say the naive implementation would be for each field you get an endpoint, like a gRPC endpoint, but that will probably be dumb. But then, like what you're saying, actually coming up with the query and making it a persistent query, and then making that a gRPC endpoint, yeah. That's cool.
But then it's kind of like less generic. People can't like query anything after that. But it's really what you're like. If you're lucky enough to already have GraphQL queries defined by the client, they're telling you like the use cases they're interested in. So if you could like generate like backend services using that, but that's that gets complex.
But that's also part of the things when we started building Mesh, we had a couple of different like we needed to do SOAP, we needed to do Open API, JSON schema, and Thrift, I think. But then during that process, like gRPC came, there's like someone from the community who really contributed a lot of code for the gRPC conversion. And then there was the OData, which was the most amazing thing, because we thought, well, what's the biggest OData API out there? And it was the MS Graph API.
Right.
And we did this, and we generated, they built like 2 years ago, they did a POC where they manually wrote the GraphQL server. It didn't work. We just generated it, and it worked much more performant and everything. Then we contacted them, and now we like talk to them, work with them, and it's but during all that process, it was super interesting just to learn. Like it opened our eyes about all the different API specs that are out there and all the cool stuff that are out there before GraphQL came in.
No, yeah, GraphQL is not the first thing to bring a API like spec or description for sure. The Microsoft Graph thing is the most, especially since you've like now worked with GraphQL-Mesh and Microsoft Graph. It's like the most confusing thing ever for people, because
they have GraphQL. And they have like they also have this kind of like playground, and it's like very similar to graphical, and it's super interesting.
Yeah, it's very similar to graphical. The name really makes it seem like it might be GraphQL, but it's not. So a lot of people get confused. So what's next for you and the Guild? What are you working on these days? You talked about the gRPC tool. Are you busy with other tools, or you've got enough on your on your plate?
I think so. One big thing that we're gonna, I guess, next thing is actually the next version of schema stitching. Again, we're open for namings and stuff. It's already now very different than it was on version 4, and we're putting out version 4 just because we wanted to, like, we have to introduce some breaking changes there. I think it's very interesting for people to check out. I would say, we have a lot of different tools out there. And we try to avoid, even though with Mesh it was a bit that, we try to avoid big launches. Like we try to avoid, here is the amazing thing we just built, like you have to use it, it's the best thing in the world, those things. Because if you look, I think the CodeGen is the best example. CodeGen started, I think, 4 years ago. It started from a PR to Apollo CodeGen, but they didn't want it. So it just slowly, was there, and everyone was like, why are you doing this? It doesn't make any sense. There's Apollo CodeGen, it's amazing. But it was different philosophies. And it just, every day, it added more things. And now it's a completely different thing. Also, just 2 weeks ago, we completely changed it. We work with this inside of another big product in Microsoft. And just from working on huge code bases, we actually introduced the change recently to GraphQL.js, that completely simplified of how you use CodeGen. So instead of announcing big things, we just, each one of those toolings, we just try to listen to the community. Like there's so much. I think sometimes in open source, people don't fully utilizes the amazing feedback that people give on the repositories. And I feel like if you have, I don't know, over 100 issues, you're just losing so much information that people are bringing you. So we're just trying to slowly, like just handle the thing and slowly grow the tool. So yeah, so
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's so nice to see like you're not only you're having this open source feedback where you get amazing feedback, as you said. You're also working with like enterprises, which have like real problems, like not only the cool ones, right? You're dealing with like legacy problems that are probably like 98% of people are dealing with, but we don't hear so much about those. So you combine like kind of both, and I think it's why your tools seem like so like high quality and solving real problems. Like you're not a solution looking for a problem. You're like actually solving problems, which is nice. So I think we're gonna end this here. Do you want to anything you want to plug? I know I'll definitely link your website. Anything else?
So I'll just say one thing that we've done. So like we want to grow all those tools. We slowly grow them. So first of all, we're opening more and more communication channels. Like one thing that I want to tell people, sometimes they think, open source people are like this genius people, amazing people. People are afraid to talk with them. Like we're not. We're just figuring out everything as it goes. And the more, if you have any questions or anything, like you can just even email me directly. Like my email is like public on my GitHub profile. We're all of us are like that. Just reach out to us on anything. We do a lot of like free architectural reviews for companies just for fun. It's just interesting to see use cases for us. The other thing I would add is just we want to do the same with the foundation. So we joined the GraphQL Foundation. We felt like, things also there could be move a bit faster. So we're rewriting the GraphQL.org in Gatsby.
Really?
And GraphQL.org, I think, is a very, very important resource. So if anyone, wants to help us make GraphQL.org better, because it's the first result on Google, and then even if you gave up in the past, come again. Same things for GraphQL.js, same things for everything in the foundation. Like we really hope that we can, help do our part into making this thing grow again.
Yeah, that's awesome. We need to have you on again. I think there's like 1,000 things we would have loved to talk about here today, but that was great. So thank you so much. For us, we're going to be back next Tuesday. Sorry about all the little mechanical problems today. It wasn't, it's definitely just an unlucky day for all of us, but it was still a ton of fun. And we'll see you next week. We don't have a confirmed guest, but we have a few in mind, so it should be good. And this video is going to be on YouTube. We have the 2 others with Scott and Dan, the first one as well, that you can watch if you haven't seen. And yeah, I'll announce the guest soon. So thank you again, Uri.
Thank you for having me.
See you later.